Hello, friends. This is Eli from Mystic Circuits. And today I'll be showing you how to build the 0 HP button. This isn't the hardest kit, but it's also not the easiest. I wouldn't suggest starting with it just because there's a couple of easy places to make annoying problems, and most of it has to do with aligning the buttons. So let's go ahead and open up the kit, show you how to make everything today. And we're going to go ahead and start out by making sure that we have all of our necessary parts. So you'll see one of my buttons just flew away. Basically, the first thing you should see are the instructions. You'll see a picture of the board with nothing soldered on. This is instructions that should be for people who know what they're doing. It'll make it a little easier. And then there's a QR code. The QR code is most likely how you came across this video, but there's also a written manual on how to build these that'll give you some nice pointers on everything step by step. So we're trying to cover our bases, show all the different ways to do this. And yeah, so now we're going to take a look at this piece of paper. You'll see 2 resistors, one button that is still in the tape, and another button that should still be in the tape over here. All right, something like that. So there are 2 buttons. I'll show you how to tell them apart in case one of them fell off the paper already later on. But for now, you should just make sure there are 2 buttons and 2 resistors. Put this to the side, and then there's another bag with all of the other relevant parts inside. So we're just going to go ahead and open it up and dump everything out in order to verify that we have it all. You'll see right here we have the main circuit board. That's an important part of the process, so go ahead and put that down. We have 2 short and 2 long sides. The short sides have a hole in them, have 2 holes in them. The long sides have our name. Then you'll see the bottom of the board, which is the same on both sides, or the bottom of the case and the top of the case, which is different on both sides. So you can see on one side it says attenuator, and on the other side it says button. We obviously want the button side. Then you should see 4 jacks. Obviously a very important part of the build. And then the case hardware, you have 4 rubber feet, 4 bolts that will hold the case together, and then 4 nuts that attach to the bolts. All right, so with everything here, that should be everything that you need in order to build your 0 HP button. We're going to go ahead and put the case stuff to the side for now. I'll leave the jacks down here, move all of this stuff over here, and we are just going to focus on the circuit board and these parts. All right, so I'm in a little bit, maybe refocus. I'm going to be focusing in and out a lot today. I hope you can be patient with that. Basically, we're going to start out with the easiest parts, which is the resistors. So go ahead and take these resistors off the tape, off of your paper. Put the paper to the side for now. And we're going to take off these little pieces of tape that are on both sides of the resistors that are just sort of there to help package them. Now, these are 22K resistors, and there's going to be 2 little footprints on your case that have a 22K next to the footprint. And you'll see there's a big circle around one of the holes and then a little circle over here, and they're connected with a line that indicates that your resistor is making a connection from this hole to that hole. All right, so I'm going to take this resistor, I'm going to kind of hold it by the body and then bend the leg over so that it makes sort of like a U-turn. Right, like that. And then I'm going to go ahead and place the long side of the resistor through that hole with the white circle in it, and the short side through the hole next to it. All right. And then I'm going to go over on the other side. And what we want to do, I've shown this in a couple of the other builds, but basically we're going to bend the legs over. I'm using my finger in order to push the resistor into the board in order to make sure it's not like sitting up here while we're doing this, right? We want our resistor to be as close to the board as possible. And I got to focus this manually. Manually focus. All right. So now we have our other leg sticking out. We want that to go kind of diagonally to the side. The idea being that when we're actually sticking our solder onto these legs, we're not accidentally getting it into any of these other holes that are sitting around over here. And I think you folks have gotten far enough that hopefully we can solder these two resistors at the same time. I'm going to make a little U-turn with the resistor. Stick the long leg through the big hole with the white circle and the small leg through the hole next to it. All right. And then we turn it over. We want this leg to be going this way, this leg to be going that way, right? Basically, we want to avoid accidentally soldering something that doesn't already have. If you accidentally get solder from this leg to that leg, it's not that big a deal because you could just wipe the solder away, right? If you accidentally get solder from this leg into this hole, it's going to make it a big pain in the butt to get the actual switch into here later on. The planning side of soldering can really help make things go more smoothly throughout the process. So we're focusing in here. And if you've never soldered before, this wouldn't be my first kit, but if it is, I'm going to have a video down below just showing the basic sort of theory of soldering, best practices, how to stay safe with both heat, chemicals in your solder. But the first thing we do whenever we solder, zoom out a little bit for this, is we tin our iron. And basically what that means is we take some solder, we waste a little bit, just sort of making sure that the tip of our iron is nice and shiny and coated in fresh solder. Going to make sure that we are able to melt the solder onto our board effectively. All right. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I've placed the board in such a way that these two connections are sort of like pointing in the same direction as my iron. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start on the outside because I'm right-handed. I want to start all the way to the right side of the board and work my way left. I'm going to place my iron next to the point that I want to solder. You don't use the tip because that reduces the surface area. What you want to do is you want to place your iron next to the side, use it to heat up the entire leg, and then press the solder into the point that you want it to land on. Leave it there for a moment after you're done, and then move it away. Let's kind of visually inspect, make sure that the solder actually ended up in there. And I'm going to do this leg right here. Do the same thing. Iron on the side of the joint, press the solder into the joint. Visually inspect, make sure everything looks good. I'm going to flip the board around. And we're going to do the same thing, but in the other direction. All right. That all looks good to me, but if you want to make sure that your joints are done correctly, you should wait a moment because these legs will still be hot for a second or two after you're done soldering them, and then you lift them away from the board. You just kind of wiggle the leg, make sure that this blob of solder that's connected to the board doesn't appear to be moving as you are wiggling. If it does move, then you know it's a bad joint and you need to heat it up again with your solder until the solder has liquefied and flowed onto the joint again. And you'll kind of notice that all of these joints make a nice little Hershey's Kiss shape, right? You can see as I move this, the joint doesn't want to move. That's a good sign. What we don't want is for those little balls of solder to move around as we move the legs. So now that I've checked all of these points, we're going to go ahead and chop off the legs with our wire cutters. I am throwing the legs away directly because it helps reduce the amount of clutter on my desk. I just did 2 of those kind of as a reflex, but before you know what you're doing, you should probably cut the legs one at a time. Also, when you're cutting legs, what you want is for both sides to be kind of squeezed between the clippers instead of grabbing the leg and kind of yanking away. That can cause the joint that you just made to fail. All right, so now this is what the top of your board should look like, and this is what the bottom should look like. You can see we've only soldered those points in the middle of the board. I apologize if my voice keeps going in and out. I'm looking at the monitor to my side as I'm doing this. So now we have our board, and now we have these 2 buttons, right? And the latching, you'll notice, is at the top. The momentary is at the bottom, just like it is on our page. I'm going to go ahead and show you how to tell, because annoyingly, these buttons do not have any visual signifier in order to indicate that one's latching and one's momentary. You can see that they look exactly the same. However, they behave differently, all right? The momentary one, when you press it down, it'll bounce right back up to the same height that it was at, right? The latching button, when you push it down, it's going to kind of sit in there because it's stuck on. And you press it again, and it extends because now it's stuck off. Stuck on, stuck off. Stuck on, stuck off. It kind of like almost does like a little zigzag, right? And that's because the latching button is going to remember that you want it to be on or off. It has a little mechanism that sort of locks it in place, whereas the momentary button just bounces up and down. It's only on when you're pressing it, and then when you release it, it forgets about it and it stays off until you press it again. All right. So we're going to start with the momentary button. And in order to make sure that everything is going correctly, we are going to only solder the corners until we've verified that everything is nice and flat, because it can be a real pain to reorient these buttons once they're done, right? And we're going to do this one at a time. This is why this board is a little bit harder. If you've done the attenuator, we did something very similar, but this one requires a little bit more attention because these buttons don't really stay in the position they're supposed to be in when you just leave them. So, and I'm doing it first just because I think it's important to be paying as much attention to this as possible, and that with no other clutter on the board, it's really easy to figure out what's going on. So again, before you solder this, for the love of God, make sure that this is the momentary button. It bounces right back up to the same height as it did before you pressed it. Again, in comparison, the latching button sticks down, sticks up, sticks down, and alternates every time you press it. If you have to watch this section again, I think it's worth it before pressing these buttons and figuring it out that you did it wrong. I mean, worst comes to worst, it's just that the labels will be mixed up, but still, you might as well save yourself the hassle. So a funny little secret about soldering is that the solder will sort of stay wherever you've positioned it, and that makes it so that it's almost like you have a little extra hand that you're able to move the solder around with, right? So what we're going to do, I'm going to solder, let's just say this upper right-hand corner, right? Refocus this. So our solder is just floating right here. I'm going to solder this corner, and I'm going to do that by taking my iron, placing it against the corner that we want soldered, and then I'm moving the entire thing, both my iron and the board, into the solder that's floating in the air, right? I'm going to try and do this a little bit more from the side. I think it'll work better. And you can see it might not work right away. Can be a good idea to tin your iron before you do this. I kind of wish I'd done that, but it looks like it just worked. And now you can see that one pin is soldered in. Now we're going to make sure our button is nice and flat. Press against it. It shouldn't move around at all. And I'm just going to manually solder the point in the other corner just to keep everything nice and stationary. All right. Moving my fume extractors around a little bit, but okay. So now you can see we have each corner, opposite corner of the button is soldered, and we are going to leave it like that until we can double check with the case that everything is in the right position. All right. So now we have our latching button. I'm sorry if at this point you've discovered that this is the momentary button, but this is supposed to be the latching button. We're going to do the same thing. Place it in the footprint it has. You might have to kind of like wiggle or like get 3 sides in and then push against one of the sides in order to get it all aligned, but eventually it should lay flat like this, right? So now you can see both of these are flat. I'm going to push into this and we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to have this little floating piece of solder. So sometimes I like to call this the cobra, right? Because it's kind of arching around and raising its head like a cobra or like a fish hook or something like that, right? Now I'm going to do this corner right here. All right, so I have my iron flat up against it, and now I'm just pushing it into this solder until it melts. All right. And the point where we know we want to stop is when we can't see that little hole where the pin used to be anymore. In fact, as you can see, that hole is still visible, which means I have to take another stab at it. So I'm going to go ahead and it helps to try and lay your iron as flat as you can. I'm going to leave it next to it until I can see that the solder has melted on. And I'm kind of pushing it into the pin. Right. Come on. I'm going to try another corner. Sometimes that's easier. I'm going to try this corner instead. Pushing my flat iron into the solder. Okay. You never know. Sometimes a particular solder joint can be a little ornery. So if that is the case, go ahead and just move to another corner. Now I'm going to go ahead and do the opposite corner again. You can tell I'm grumpy because I've filmed like 4 of these already. Sometimes the filming energy, it just runs out towards the end of the day. So now we're looking at our board. These opposite pins are all soldered, right? They don't need to be like the same on both of them. You just want to make sure whichever corner you have soldered, you have a corner in the opposite side, and then you go back and look and just verify that your buttons are nice and flat against the board, right? They're not going to be perfect, but I can tell like this one is at a slight angle. Yeah, in fact, okay, I'm glad I caught this. This one's at a slight angle, and I want, you can see these pins over here. What I want, you can even see that the buttons are slightly out of alignment. What I want to do is I want to push it this way with this side of the buttons going flatter against the board. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to solder that pin because that pin is on the side of the board that I want flattened. I'm just going to push in to the board with the button while heating up and melting the solder on that pin. And it looks a lot nicer than it did before. All right, but again, we need to verify everything with the case on before we solder the rest of it. So what we're going to do, we're going to put our jacks into the board. You can see we have these 3 legs on the jacks. Each jack goes on one of these little rectangles. So there's 3 holes in the rectangle. So just line up the legs with the jack. The part where the cable goes into is facing away from it's facing off the edge of the board each time. Now, just press into all of these, make sure they're as flat as they can be. And now it's wiggling around a little bit, but it should still be fairly simple to, all right. So this one might require a little bit of practice. So what we're going to do is we're going to push into the tab on the outer edge of the board. The funny thing about this build is from a soldering standpoint, like electrically, it's very simple, but there's just like a lot of weird little things that can get misaligned, right? So that's why I don't suggest it for beginners. But you can see, and I'll show again, and then we're going to verify, just like we did with the buttons, that everything is nice and flat before we solder all the pins. It's so much easier to realign a part with just 1 pin soldered in than all of them, right? So I'm pushing into my circuit board, into this outer pin with my iron, right? And then I flow the solder on. The solder is going to hold that joint stationary. And then we're going to go ahead and look, and it's actually, this is kind of a good example because you can already see, right, that this jack, if I push in, it's moving, and there's a little gap underneath. That's what we're trying to avoid. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my finger on that jack that was moving. I'm going to heat up the joint that's holding it still, and then I'm going to press into it, and you can see the solder melted and is now dry. And once we are looking at that side again, it doesn't move around at all when I press it, right? And be careful again that heating up the solder on the bottom of the board can actually conduct heat into the rest of the jack. So what you want to be touching is the plastic part of the body. Try not to touch the actual metal in the middle. All right, so we're going to test. Those 2 look fine. This one, it's not terrible, but it does have a little bit of space underneath. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing again, touching the plastic part. I'm applying heat to the pin that has already been soldered until it melts, and then I press in from the other side. Wait for the solder to dry so that it's not moving around anymore, and then just verify everything seems to look good. All right. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to solder the rest of the lugs on the jacks. And I've mentioned this in other videos, but what I like to do is I like to do all of the lugs that are facing the same direction, right? Because they're flat in one direction. Makes it so that you can just stick your iron on the side. I'm going to rotate the whole thing. We're going to do the other ones. And this is one of the units where there are normalized connections, so we're going to just go ahead and do all of the jack pins because you don't want an issue from not soldering the side pins. All right. Now it looks like all of our jacks have been soldered. All right. So now what we're going to do is we're going to use a couple pieces from our case in order to verify that everything feels good here, right? First off, we're going to, just like with the other situations, we're going to make sure that the text from both the circuit board and the lid are aligned. If one of them is facing the opposite direction, that's a problem. Flip it over. You want the side that says Butt0n and not attenuator. And we're going to go ahead and put the buttons through, right? You should just feel around. Hopefully they don't feel like they're scratching the side of the circuit board, but we're going to go ahead and put in the sides as well in order to make sure that everything is fitting nice and snugly. So the sides have a little tab sticking up off the top that goes through a hole in the lid. All right, so it should look like that. And then we're going to do it on the other side. All right, and you should feel it kind of snap into place. Now, you got your top and your sides. Should be looking like this. And this is the point where pressing these buttons should be easy. If one of them gets kind of like scraped up against the side of the hole or feels like it doesn't have good action or ability to do what it's supposed to do, obviously the latching button gets stuck up or down depending on when you press it. But if the momentary button gets stuck down, these are the kind of problems that we're looking for, right? But if everything feels like it's working the way that it should be and is playing nicely, then we can go ahead and solder the rest of the pins underneath the bottom of the board. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and just start on one side. I think that's the one that was kind of complaining. So I'm going to try it from a different direction. Right, I know that these pins are small, but they're technically flatter in one direction than in the other one. So it looks like we got that. Go ahead and this middle one. All right. Sometimes if a pin doesn't want to be soldered, it's because you're not getting the iron to make full enough contact with it. So it helps to just kind of try it from a different angle, right? And like I've been saying this whole time, it's good to kind of rotate the board in order to do that rather than your arm, just because it's good to have all of these things feel as natural as possible. Right, and I can tell already I'm going to have to reflow some of these pins. So you can see all of the pins are full, but some of them are kind of close to each other, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go down the line, heat up the solder on every single pin until it melts, and then just kind of pull away. And actually what I should be doing is cleaning my tip after each pin just to get rid of any excess solder. I'm not putting it, I'm not tinning it again, right? Like, even though I probably should have done that before I started this, I'm just getting all the excess solder off in the gold foil. But I'm just making sure that every pin has a nice solid connection and is has no spare solder that's connecting adjacent pins. And is a nice happy solder joint. All right. I'll go ahead and zoom in just a tiny bit so that you can see what everything is supposed to look like at this point. I realize I'm having trouble getting this to focus correctly, but if I can just, that looks pretty good. All right. So you can see here, each button has a row of 2 pins or 3 pins. It has 2 rows of 3 pins, right? And all of those are separated. Ooh, there's even maybe a little bit of solder that's connecting these two. What we're going to do to fix that, we're going to stick our iron in between the two, and you kind of just like wiggle them apart, and then you pull away. All right. And that should get the solder to move. Soldering irons, they're both your pencil and your eraser, right? I'm even maybe going to add a tiny bit, just because this one doesn't seem to want to make like one of those little Hershey's Kisses. It has like the solder sticking off to the side. Sometimes adding some solder helps with that. And then you just kind of pull straight up, take it away. But yeah, that joint looks a lot better now. It's not touching the adjacent points, right? And like before, we're going to go ahead and cut the bottom of these just to make sure that none of them are touching each other and to avoid accidental connections with the bottom of the case. You can see very clearly that there's a space in between all of those points. I might even just reflow this one just because it's getting a little too close to the others. You can see now that it's reflowed. It's actually reduced in size. It's all kind of squeezed into the middle. I'm going to go ahead and do the exact same thing on the other side. Okay, those are all looking good. I'm going to do these jack pins just in case. You just need to do the 6 that are the closest towards the middle. All right. And now this is what the bottom of our board should look like. This is what the top should look like. I'm just going to go ahead and take the lid off just so you can kind of see what everything looks like when it's done. All right. Again, momentary latching. Sometimes the plastic on the inside of these switches can get a little melted if you solder it for too long. So I'll kind of like wiggle it around. I think that's pretty good. All right. So now what we're going to do is we're going to put on the sides. We're going to finish assembling the case, all right? We're going to put the long side in. You have to align the top with the hole in the top of the case. Like that. Flip it over. Align the hole into the top side of the case. This might require a little bit of wiggling things around until it all just sort of fits in place. And then we're going to take the bottom, make sure that the tabs are aligned with the positions of the holes. And I'm going to put the tabs into the holes. On one side, you might have to, again, wiggle things around. This is kind of the most hand-wavy part of the entire process. But if you squeeze it all together, kind of push in, it should make a finished case. It all fits together like a puzzle piece, right? And now we're going to take our case hardware again. Take one of our bolts, put it through one of the corners, press it all the way through. And then take a rubber foot. You'll see there's a little cavity in the rubber foot. We put one of the nuts in there. Press your finger against the nut to keep it from falling out. And press in while you're screwing the bolt in order to hopefully help it mate with the actual bolt. right? So doing it like this, put the nut into the cavity, screw with a Phillips head screwdriver, nut, foot, do this again, bolt, foot, nut, screw. And if it doesn't mate, sometimes it helps to push to the side on the foot in order to help the edge of the bolt kind of catch the nut. All right, so this is a finished case. I'll go ahead and upload another little section to this video in order to show you how to test and make sure your button is working correctly. All right, this is going to be a nice and quick demo on how to check your Butt0n DIY kit. We're going to go ahead and plug 2 sound sources into the in and pan jacks. I have 2 oscillators from the 3-body here. We're going to plug out of the mix and then turn on this button. You should be able to hear them. If you press the momentary button, it should turn off. On again, off, on. Make sure that they all have nice action, right? Turn it off, turn these back on, off, on. All right, now if you go up to this top position and you press this button, you should just hear the lower, or the oscillator plugged into here. And then if you do this and you unplug here, you should just hear the oscillator plugged into there. So there you go. Real exciting Butt0n demo. I hope it all worked out and that you're having fun with your Butt0n. And yeah, thanks for watching.